How's it going, everyone? I'm Landan with LMR.com. In today's video, we're going to be showing you how to install a set of our SVE coilovers on your 2015 to 2020 Mustang. First things first here, guys. If you want to know a little bit more about the specifics of our SVE coilover kit, then check out the review video. So with our immense library of Mustang how-to videos, we already have a video explaining the removal steps for the shocks, struts, and springs. So for this install, we're going to begin with all of that already off of the car. Now going into the install, I would recommend above average mechanical ability and a decent selection of tools. Of course, average shop equipment, you're going to need that too. So enough of me talking, let's get rolling. To get started, lay out all of the components and familiarize yourself with everything that is included in the kit. It doesn't matter where you begin, but we're going to start with the front first. If it isn't already, safely support the car via a lift or jack stands. Go ahead and remove the lower strut mount from the fully threaded strut body and apply some anti-seize to the lower part of the strut. Reinstall the lower strut mount and rotate the mount until the bottom of the threaded body is 4 inches inside of the mount by measuring from the bottom. Doing this will establish a predetermined height for the bump stop. Run the lower collar down against the lower strut mount, but don't tighten it with the spanner wrench. You'll want to leave this loose because you may have to rotate the lower mount so that it lines up with the spindle. Rotate the spring perch until there is no play in the spring. Run up the adjusting collar and tighten the two against each other with the spanner wrenches. Go ahead and do this for the other strut assembly. Verify that you have the correct strut for whichever side you are going to be working on. The driver's side is marked with an L on the camber plate, and the passenger side is marked with an R. Whenever that is verified, install the strut into the car with the camber plate oriented correctly. While holding the strut, finger tighten the 3 provided retaining nuts. Before moving forward, make note of the slotted upper hole in the strut. This allows for additional camber adjustment if it's needed. Position the spindle into the strut and then install the strut to spindle hardware in the factory orientation, which is what is shown. Thread on the retaining nuts and tighten them down. The factory torque spec for these is 184 pound-feet. Adjust the provided sway bar end link to the same length as the factory end link. This is done by loosening the jam nuts and rotating each end link so that they mimic the factory piece. Whenever this is done, retighten the jam nuts against the center adjuster. Install the end link in the same orientation as the factory one was. Thread on the retaining nuts and then use a combination of a 19mm wrench and a 6mm Allen socket to tighten the nuts. Torque the 3 strut mount retaining nuts to 14.5 pound-feet. Reinstall the brake rotor and hold it in place with a lug nut. Reposition the brake caliper over the rotor. Align the bolt holes and reinstall the retaining hardware. Since we're running the Ford Performance M2300Y brake kit on this car, this kit has a GT350 front brake caliper, so the retaining bolts will have a torque spec of 136 pound-feet. All other brake caliper retaining hardware will have a torque spec of 85 pound-feet. Go ahead and repeat these same steps for the other side. Now it's time to head to the rear of the car. So with either side of the IRS cradle supported and detached from the body of the car, verify that the lower spring isolator is positioned correctly within the lower control arm. The upper isolator will not be reused. If needed, lower the cradle and install the rear spring and perch at the same time. Make sure that the lower spring pigtail is aligned with the lower isolator. Jack up on the IRS cradle and reinstall the rearward 21mm bolt, followed by the frontward 21mm bolt, and the IRS cradle support bracket, and the two smaller bolts. Tighten the smaller 13mm cradle support bracket to body bolts to 41 pound-feet, and the two 21mm cradle to body bolts to 129 pound-feet. Like we did on the front strut, remove the lower shock mount from the threaded body and apply anti-seize to the threads. Next, we'll set the predetermined bump stop height for the shock. To do this, lay the factory shock on something flat with the lower shock mount up against something flat as well. Verify that the dust boot is installed and then mark the top of the bump stop. Set the factory shock aside and then position the new shock into place. Remove the pre-installed dust boot so that you can visibly see where the bump stop is. Since we'll be lowering the car, we went ahead and compensated for that and adjusted the shock so that the bump stop is approximately a 1/4 inch shorter than the factory shock. Whenever this is done, run down the locking collar and snug it down with a spanner wrench. Reinstall the dust boot and then do the same for the other shock. Set the factory shock on a workbench. If equipped, remove the plastic dust cap from the upper mount. Remove the 15mm retaining nut and then separate the upper mount from the shock. If applicable, use a drift and hammer to drive the small spacer off of the factory shock. This spacer will be transferred to the new shock. Remove the supplied nut from the new shock and remove the spacer. Reposition the upper mount in the factory orientation onto the new shock. Install the small spacer. Install the provided nut and then torque it to 22 pound-feet. Position the upper shock mount underneath the small studs in the body of the car. If needed, compress the shock by hand and then align the lower section of the shock with the bolt holes in the lower control arm. Loosely install all 4 of the retaining bolts first before tightening any of them down. The lower bolts torque to 35 pound-feet, followed by the upper bolts, which torque to 66 pound-feet. If it was removed, reinstall the bolt securing the brake hose to the sway bar end-link bracket. This bolt torques to 22 pound-feet. At this time, you want to glance over your work and then go ahead and do the same for the other side. That completes the installation procedure for the SVE coilover. Now that the coilovers are installed, it's time to adjust them. To keep things nice and neat, we've also set aside another video that explains the steps you need to take in order to properly adjust your new coilovers. Once the coilovers are adjusted, you need to take the car to an alignment shop and have the car aligned. For the most up-to-date product information, pricing, and availability on anything in the video, please reference lmr.com. If you like this video or it's helped you out, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for more S550 content and turn on notifications. That way you're notified every time we release something new. Until next time, you guys know what to do by now for all things S550 Mustang. Keep it right here with the real enthusiasts, lmr.com.